I want you to understand what that means before I tell you this story, because the profession matters. It matters in the way that a surgeon's profession matters when someone tells them they're not qualified to assess a wound. I have spent 26 years designing drainage systems, flood control infrastructure, retaining structures, and water management solutions for municipalities across 4 states. I have sat in rooms with county engineers and FEMA representatives and reviewed post-flood damage assessments that would make your stomach turn. I know what water does when it has nowhere to go. I know exactly what it does. Which is why, when I bought the property on the eastern edge of Cedarbrook Ridge Estates 11 years ago, I looked at the topography first. Before I looked at the kitchen. Before I looked at the square footage. Before I looked at anything else. I stood at the back of the property with a laser level and I measured the slope. The land sat at the base of a long, gentle grade that ran down from the undeveloped conservation land to the north. The entire neighborhood drainage pattern funneled toward the low point, which was, conveniently, roughly the area where my lot and the 2 adjacent lots sat. This was not a surprise to me. It was a reason to be careful. The previous owners had done nothing about it. They had lived in the house for 8 years, and in 8 years, the backyard had flooded twice during heavy rain events, both times resulting in significant damage to the foundation perimeter and the rear landscaping. They had disclosed this in the sale documents, which is how I knew. I bought the property anyway, because I knew I could fix it. The fix took me the better part of 3 years to complete fully, though the core of it was done in the first 18 months. I regraded the back portion of the property, installed a French drain system along both side boundaries, created a small constructed wetland area in the lowest corner that could absorb and slowly release excess water, and built, along the northern boundary where the drainage flow entered my property from the conservation land, a low earthen berm. A dam. Not a dam in the dramatic Hoover Dam press conference sense. An engineered berm. A controlled water management structure roughly 38 feet long, 4 feet high at its peak, with a controlled overflow notch on the eastern end that directed excess flow into a vegetated swale that ran along the property boundary to the street drainage inlet. The whole system was permitted. I want to say that again because it becomes important later. The whole system was permitted through the county. I had the engineering drawings reviewed by the county drainage department. I had the construction inspected at 3 stages. I had the final completion signed off by a licensed inspector. I had a copy of every document in a 3-ring binder on my office shelf, tabbed and organized. The berm worked beautifully. For 7 years, my backyard stayed dry during rain events that had previously flooded it. The constructed wetland absorbed the excess flow, the French drains carried the lateral seepage away, and the overflow notch directed the truly heavy surge events safely into the street drainage system exactly as designed. My neighbors, the 2 adjacent lots also at the low point, noticed. They were grateful, actually, in the early years. My neighbor to the west, a retired teacher named Phyllis Odom, told me directly that her basement had not taken on water in 7 years, which she attributed to whatever I had done with the backyard. She brought me a pie, a real pie, not a metaphorical one, pecan. It was excellent. Phyllis was not the problem. The problem arrived in the form of the Cedarbrook Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and specifically in the form of its newly elected president, a man named Bradford Holt. Bradford Holt had moved into the neighborhood 4 years prior, purchased one of the newer homes on the upper section of the grade, and within 18 months had run for HOA president on a platform of, and I am reading from his actual campaign flyer, which I still have, restoring visual consistency and property value protection to our community. Visual consistency. I should have paid more attention to those words. Bradford's first year as president was mostly uneventful from my perspective. There were some emails about approved fence colors, a notice about seasonal decoration timelines, the normal bureaucratic texture of organized neighborhood governance. Then, in the spring of his second year, the HOA hired an outside property review firm to conduct what they called a community compliance assessment. This was Bradford's initiative. He had secured funding for it through a special assessment fee that had been approved at the annual meeting by a vote of 22 to 19, which I had not attended because I was in Oklahoma City reviewing drainage plans for a stormwater retention project. I received the compliance assessment report 6 weeks later. My property had 14 findings. 14! I will not go through all of them. Some were trivial, the kind of findings that assessment firms generate to justify their fees: paint color of the utility box cover, height of a specific ornamental grass along the driveway. But Item 7 was the berm. The assessment flagged the earthen berm along my northern boundary as and this is a direct quote, non-approved landscape modification of significant visual and structural impact that may require removal under Section 4.7 of the Community Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. I read Item 7 3 times. Then I read Section 4.7 of the CC and RS. Section 4.7 prohibited substantial alterations to the natural grade of any lot without prior HOA Architectural Review Committee approval. I had county permits. I had county approval. I did not have HOA Architectural Review Committee approval because, when I had built the berm 11 years ago, the Architectural Review Committee had consisted of one person, a man named Doug Ferris, who had since moved away, and Doug had told me verbally that water management infrastructure was outside the committee's purview. I did not have that in writing. I know. I sent the HOA a letter explaining the situation. I included copies of the county permits. I included the engineering drawings. I included the inspection sign-off documents. I offered to present the full project documentation at the next HOA board meeting. Bradford Holt responded with a letter acknowledging receipt of my documentation and informing me that the HOA's position was that county permits did not supersede HOA CC and R requirements, and that the Architectural Review Committee would need to formally evaluate the structure before it could be considered compliant. I agreed to this. I submitted a formal architectural review application. The Architectural Review Committee, which now consisted of Bradford Holt, his neighbor Cynthia Marsh, and a man named Terry who I had never met, reviewed my application over the course of 6 weeks. They denied it. Their denial letter cited 2 reasons. First, that the berm altered the natural aesthetic of the rear property line in a manner inconsistent with community standards. Second, that the structure may affect drainage patterns for neighboring properties. I read that sentence 4 times. I thought about Phyllis Odom's dry basement. I thought about 7 years of functioning flood control. I thought about what happens when you remove a structure that has been redirecting significant drainage flow for 7 years, and suddenly the water has nowhere to go except where it went before you built the thing. I wrote a detailed response to the denial. I explained, with engineering specificity, exactly what the berm was doing hydrologically. I included a drainage area map. I included flow calculations. I included a projected impact assessment of removal. The projected impact assessment was not subtle. If the berm was removed, the overflow that it currently captured and redirected would return to its pre-construction flow path. That flow path ran directly across the low section of my property, and because of the slight grade change I had made during regrading, would now also run across the rear corners of the 2 adjacent properties and into the back of the undeveloped greenbelt section that abutted the neighborhood's recreation area. In a significant rain event, the projected ponding depth in that greenbelt section was between 8 and 14 inches. The recreation area of Cedarbrook Ridge Estates, which contained the community gazebo, the playground equipment, the gravel walking path, and the small parking area used for neighborhood events sat directly adjacent to that greenbelt section. I included all of this in my response. I used clear language. I used diagrams. Bradford Holt's response arrived 3 weeks later. It was a notice of violation. The HOA had determined that my berm was in violation of Section 4.7 of the CC&RS, that my architectural review application had been denied, and that I was required to remove the structure within 90 days or face fines. The fines, per the CC&R schedule that Bradford had apparently revised at a board meeting the previous October, which I had also not attended, were set at $500 per day for continued non-compliance after the 90-day cure period. $500 per day. I called a real estate attorney. Attorney reviewed my documents over 2 weeks and gave me a careful, measured assessment. The county permits were solid. My engineering documentation was thorough. However, the CC&RS were legally binding as a covenant attached to the deed of every property in the community, and the HOA had broad latitude under Texas law to enforce aesthetic and structural standards on private improvements. The verbal approval from Doug Ferris was essentially worthless without documentation. My case was, in her words, defensible but expensive. I asked her to estimate litigation costs. She gave me a range. The low end of the range was not low. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it. I attended the next HOA board meeting. I presented my engineering documentation in person. I showed Bradford and Cynthia and Terry the drainage area map. I explained, slowly and carefully, what the berm was doing and what would happen if it was removed. Bradford listened with the expression of a man who had already decided. When I finished, he said that he appreciated the technical detail, but that the board's position remained unchanged, and that the community's aesthetic standards needed to be applied consistently. Cynthia nodded. Terry, I noticed, did not look entirely comfortable, but he did not say anything. I drove home. I sat in my garage for a long time. And then I opened my laptop and I wrote a letter. Not to the HOA. To the county drainage department. I asked them to place on record that I was being compelled by my HOA to remove a county-permitted drainage structure, and that I was formally documenting my professional assessment of the downstream consequences of that removal. They acknowledged my letter. I framed the acknowledgement and put it in the binder. Then I went to sleep. The 90-day cure period ended on a Thursday in late August. I had not removed the berm. The fines began accumulating at $500 per day. Over the next 100 days, I received 7 violation notices and a formal demand letter from the HOA's attorney. The total fine amount stated in the demand letter was $51,500. I read the demand letter carefully. Then I called my attorney. Then I called the HOA's attorney. And in that phone call, I said something that I had been holding for a very long time. I said, I'm going to remove the berm. There was a pause on the other end. You're agreeing to comply, the attorney said. I'm going to remove it, I said, completely to original grade, just like you asked. Another pause. And the fines, he said. We can discuss the fines after removal, I said. He said he would advise his client. He called back the next morning to confirm that the HOA would consider a reduction in fines upon verified removal of the structure. I thanked him. Then I called an excavation contractor. I scheduled the removal for a Friday. I checked the 10-day weather forecast. I checked it very carefully. There was a significant weather system forecast for the following Tuesday and Wednesday, a slow-moving front with projected rainfall totals of between 3 and 4.5 inches over a 36-hour period. The kind of event that, prior to my berm, would have been a meaningful drainage challenge for the low end of Cedarbrook Ridge estates. The kind of event that my drainage impact assessment had specifically modeled. I looked at the forecast for a long time. Then I confirmed the Friday removal date with the contractor. The berm came down on a sunny Friday afternoon. Clean removal, professional grade work, original grade restored within acceptable tolerance. The contractor was done by 4 p.m. I signed off on the work order. I took photographs of the finished grade from multiple angles. I sent them to the HOA's attorney with a brief note confirming compliance. Then I went inside, and I waited for Tuesday. Saturday was clear. Sunday was clear. Monday morning brought clouds. By Monday afternoon, the sky had turned the specific shade of gray that experienced people in Texas learn to read the way sailors read sea color. Not threatening exactly, just committed, the kind of sky that has made a decision. I went to my garage and made sure my sump system was operational. I checked the French drains on both sides of the property. I confirmed my own drainage was in order. Then I sat in my office and worked on a project proposal for a stormwater retention pond design in Galveston County, because irony, when it finds you, tends to find you completely. Monday night, the rain started. Steady at first, the kind of rain that makes people feel cozy if they're inside with nothing to worry about. I was inside with nothing to worry about. My side of the situation was, professionally speaking, well managed. By Tuesday morning, the rain had intensified. I stood at my back window and watched the water moving across the rear of my property exactly as I had projected it would in my removal impact assessment. The low corner was saturated. The flow was tracking north and west along the grade, seeking the path of least resistance, which was no longer the berm's controlled overflow notch because the berm no longer existed. The water was going where water goes when you remove the thing that was telling it where to go. It was going everywhere. By Tuesday afternoon, I received a text from Phyllis Odom. Phyllis, who lived to my west, who had brought me a pecan pie, who had thanked me for 7 years of dry basements. The text said, "Marcus, I have some water coming in at the back of my basement. Is everything okay with your yard?" I called her immediately. I told her what had happened. I told her about the HOA order. I told her about the berm removal. I told her exactly what was occurring hydrologically and why. There was a long silence on her end. "They made you take it down," she said. "Yes," I said. "And you told them this would happen." "I put it in writing," I said, "twice." Another silence. "Marcus," she said, "I need to call my son." "That seems reasonable," I said. I also received, around 2 p.m. on Tuesday, a call from Terry. Terry, who was on the HOA Architectural Review Committee. Terry, who had not looked entirely comfortable at the board meeting. Terry, who lived, I happen to know, on the lower section of the eastern grade, not far from the Greenbelt. "Marcus," he said, "there's water in the rec area." "Yes," I said. "Significant water," he said. "How much?" I asked. "The gazebo," he said. "The water it's coming up around the base of the gazebo." "What's the current ponding depth near the playground?" I asked. A pause. "I don't know, 6 inches, maybe more." "That's within my projected range," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "You projected this," he said. "I submitted a drainage impact assessment to the Architectural Review Committee," I said, "in March, with the formal review application." The silence that followed was the silence of a man doing a very uncomfortable calculation. "Bradford said that document was speculative," Terry said. "I'm a licensed civil engineer with 26 years of drainage design experience," I said. "That document was a professional engineering assessment." Another long pause. "The playground equipment," he said quietly, There are kids' toys floating. I looked out my back window at the rain. Yes, I said, there would be. I did not say, I told you so. I want to be clear about that. I did not say those words. I didn't need to. The words were already present in the conversation, occupying all the space between what Terry was describing and what I had written in a document that Bradford Holt had called speculative. Terry said he needed to go. I told him to stay safe. By Tuesday evening, the rain was easing slightly, but the accumulated volume was still working its way through the drainage system. I received 3 more texts from neighbors, one from a woman on the street behind mine whose rear fence had partially separated from the saturated posts, one from a man named Howard 2 lots away from the wreck area who had 2 inches of standing water in his detached garage, one from Phyllis again, updating me that the basement water had reached the base of her water heater. I documented all of these. I added them to the binder. By Wednesday morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was a clear, washed blue, the kind that appears after heavy weather as if the atmosphere is apologizing. I made coffee. I walked to the back of my property and looked at the grade. The water was receding, tracking exactly as the post-removal flow model predicted. My yard was handling its portion of the drainage load efficiently. The French drains were doing their job. I walked to the front of the house and looked at the street. Then I drove slowly through the neighborhood. The wreck area was still partially inundated, though the depth had dropped from the Tuesday afternoon peak. The gazebo was intact, but surrounded by standing water. The gravel walking path had been scoured in several sections, the gravel displaced into the grass. The playground area had a layer of sediment deposit across the rubber matting surface. Several of the lower-grade properties had visible water staining on their fence lines and foundation areas. Bradford Holt's house was on the upper section of the grade. Bradford Holt's house was, of course, fine. I drove back home and sat down at my desk and composed a detailed incident report, property by property, observation by observation, with time stamps and photographs I had taken during the drive. I sent it to my attorney. I sent a copy to the county drainage department, noting that this was a follow-up to my earlier letter documenting the forced removal of a county-permitted drainage structure. Then I sent a letter to Bradford Holt. Not an angry letter. A professional letter. In it, I noted the rainfall event, the documented flooding outcomes, and the correlation between the removal of the berm and the drainage impacts observed. I noted that these outcomes had been specifically forecast in my March impact assessment, which had been submitted to and reviewed by the Architectural Review Committee. I noted that the county had a record of my formal documentation of the forced removal. I closed the letter with a single question. It was this: given the outcomes of this weather event, the HOA may wish to reconsider both the outstanding fine balance and the long-term drainage management plan for the low-gradient section of the community. I am available to consult on redesign of the water management infrastructure at standard professional rates. I sent it certified mail. I also, and I want to be precise about this, sent copies to every member of the HOA board, to Terry, to Phyllis Odom, and to the 6 other neighbors who had texted me during the event. Transparency. It's important. The response from Bradford came 11 days later. It was not the response I expected. It was, in structure and tone, the most uncomfortable document I have ever received, and I have received a lot of documents. In it, Bradford acknowledged the rainfall event and its impacts. He acknowledged that my engineering documentation had forecast these impacts. He acknowledged, in language that had clearly been reviewed by an attorney before sending, that the HOA's decision-making process had not fully accounted for the technical analysis provided. He did not use the words, "we were wrong," but the shape of the letter was the shape of those words. He also noted that the HOA board had voted, at an emergency meeting the previous week, to suspend the outstanding fine balance pending a full review of the compliance action. $51,500 suspended. Not waived, suspended. But I had learned something about patience. The full review took 8 weeks. At the end of it, I was invited to present my drainage documentation again, this time to a full board meeting with 3 additional community members present as observers, including Phyllis Odom, who arrived with a folder of her own photographs of the basement water damage, and Howard, who brought his insurance claim estimate. I presented for 40 minutes. I answered questions for another 30. At the end, Bradford made a motion. The motion was to formally recognize my original berm construction as a community drainage benefit structure, retroactively approve the architectural review application, reduce the outstanding fine balance to 0, and authorize the HOA to enter into a professional services agreement with me to design a permanent drainage management solution for the affected area of the community. The vote was 5-0. Terry, I noticed, voted first. The professional services agreement took another month to negotiate. The scope included redesign of the berm and overflow structure, upgraded French drain infrastructure for the 2 adjacent low-point properties, and a grading modification to the greenbelt section that would create a proper retention area before the rec space. The fee was not insubstantial. Bradford signed it without comment. Construction began in the spring. The new berm is better than the original, more refined, better integrated into the landscape. The overflow structure is more elegant, the constructed wetland area larger, the whole system more capable of handling the rainfall projections I've run for the next 50 years of climate modeling. Phyllis brought me another pie when construction finished. Coconut cream this time. Also excellent. The rec area has not flooded since. The gazebo is fine. The playground equipment is fine. And Bradford Holt, who I see occasionally at neighborhood events, nods at me with the specific nod of a man who has learned something he wishes he had not needed to learn the way he learned it. I nod back. I hold no ill will toward Bradford. I hold no ill will toward anyone in this story. Because here is the thing about water and about engineering and about what happens when you spend 26 years understanding how the world actually works physically. You cannot negotiate with gravity. You cannot fine a drainage slope into compliance. You cannot pass a resolution that changes where water goes when it rains. The laws of physics are not members of your HOA. They did not vote. They will not be moved by a demand letter. And when you remove something that was doing important, invisible work, quietly and competently, year after year, the absence of that thing makes itself known. Not right away, sometimes, but eventually. Always eventually. That is the thing about infrastructure, about the systems that make places livable, that protect the ground people walk on and sleep above and raise their children near. Those systems work best when they are understood, when someone has taken the time to think carefully about the water and the slope and the load and the flow, and has translated that thinking into something solid and real and engineered to last. When someone has done that work, the right response is not a violation notice. The right response is a pie. I'm Marcus Ellery. I'm a civil engineer. And if you have a drainage problem, do not wait for it to become someone else's flood. Fix it. Document it. And if anyone tells you that your solution looks inconsistent with community standards, hand them your engineering drawings and explain, patiently, exactly what is going to happen if they insist on ignoring them. Then wait. The rain will come. It always does. Thank you for watching. If you're new here, this is where we tell HOA stories, neighbor stories, and the specific kind of stories where being right takes a long time, but eventually, quietly, completely, the facts do the talking for you. Subscribe if that's your kind of story. And drop your own situation in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.